My son had been dead for 2 years. That's what my daughter-in-law told me. That's what the death certificate said. That's what I put on a headstone in Clearwater Memorial Cemetery on a Tuesday morning in November while my grandchildren cried into my coat. Until a postcard arrived with no return address, and the handwriting on it was unmistakably my son's. Before I tell you what was written on that postcard, I need to know something. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Because what I'm about to share with you is the kind of story that changes the way you look at everything, the people you trust, the grief you carry, and just how far some people will go for money. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 64 years old. I spent most of my life on 47 acres outside Billings, Montana, running a cattle operation that my father started and that I always assumed my son would carry on after me. My wife, Carol, passed from ovarian cancer 6 years ago. After she went, it was just me and the land and the hope that my son and his family would eventually move back from Portland and make this place a home again. My son's name is Caleb. He married his wife 11 years ago. She was beautiful and polished in a way that always made me feel like she was performing rather than living. Carol noticed it first, the way she laughed a beat too late at jokes, the way her eyes stayed flat even when her mouth was smiling. I told Carol she was being uncharitable. I told myself the same thing for a long time after Carol was gone. Caleb worked in commercial real estate in Portland. He was good at it. He'd built something real over 12 years, a client list, a reputation, a partnership track. His daughter Emma was 9, and his son Tyler was 6 when everything fell apart. They were the kind of kids who made noise in the best possible way, tracking mud through the kitchen, arguing over the television remote, falling asleep on the couch with their shoes still on. Every time they visited the ranch, something inside me that had gone quiet after Carol died came back to life. In March, 2 years ago, my daughter-in-law called me at 7 in the morning. There had been an accident on Highway 30, she said. A jackknifed semi. Caleb's car was crushed on the passenger side. He hadn't made it. Her voice was steady in a way I couldn't understand, the kind of steady that takes practice. I sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs stopped working. I don't remember the next 4 hours. The funeral was small. Closed casket because of the damage to the vehicle, she told me. I held Emma's hand through the whole service. Tyler was too young to understand fully and kept asking when his dad was coming back. My daughter-in-law wore black and accepted condolences with graceful efficiency. After the burial, she moved the children back to Portland, back to the house she and Caleb had shared. And I drove home to the ranch alone. Grief has a geography. Mine was the ranch, every fence line Caleb had helped me mend, the barn where he'd learned to drive the old Ford tractor, the kitchen table where Carol used to read him bedtime stories on winter nights when the power went out. I moved through it like a man underwater. The months blurred. I saw Emma and Tyler on holidays, when my daughter-in-law permitted it, which was less and less over time. She was busy, she said. The children were adjusting. She'd let me know when a visit made sense. That was the word she used. When a visit made sense. I was at the hardware store in Billings on an ordinary Wednesday in October when I got back to my truck and found a stack of mail I'd grabbed from the box that morning still sitting on the passenger seat. Mostly catalogs and bills. At the bottom, a postcard. The front showed a generic mountain landscape, the kind sold at every gas station in the Northwest. No stamp. It had been hand-delivered into my rural mailbox, not mailed through any postal service. I almost set it aside. Then I turned it over. The handwriting stopped my heart. Caleb had a very specific way of writing the letter G, a small loop at the bottom that curved left instead of right, something Carol used to tease him about. It was on every birthday card he'd ever sent me, every note he'd ever left on the refrigerator. That loop was on the postcard, in the word that opened the 3 lines of text. Dad, I'm alive. Don't tell her. Nothing else. No location. No signature. No explanation of who she referred to or where he was. I sat in that hardware store parking lot for 20 minutes before my hands stopped shaking enough to drive. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because it matters. My first instinct was to call my daughter-in-law. My second instinct, sharper and colder, said no. Don't tell her. That's what the postcard said. And something about the flatness in her voice on that March morning 2 years ago, something I'd pushed down and called grief, suddenly surfaced like a warning I'd been ignoring the whole time. I drove home. I put the postcard in the lockbox where I kept Carol's jewelry, I sat on the porch until dark, watching the cattle move across the lower field, and I tried to think like a man who had not just had his world turned upside down a second time. The next morning, I called Ray Denton. Ray had been Yellowstone County Sheriff for 18 years before he retired, and he'd been my neighbor for 30. We'd fixed fence lines together and buried our wives in the same cemetery 18 months apart. If I trusted anyone on earth to think straight when I couldn't, it was Ray. He listened to everything without interrupting. Then he took the postcard in his hands, examined the handwriting for a long time, and put it back on my kitchen table. "Tell me about the accident," he said. I told him everything I knew, which I realized as I was speaking was almost nothing. A highway accident, a closed casket, a death certificate I'd never requested a copy of independently. I had taken every piece of information from one source, and that source was my daughter-in-law. Ray's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. "You have a lawyer?" I did. Tom Garrett, down in Billings, who'd helped me update my will after Carol passed. I called him from Ray's kitchen table. By that afternoon, the three of us were sitting together, and Tom was saying things that made the room tilt. Under Montana law, without independent verification, a death certificate filed in another county by a spouse would be accepted at face value. If the body had been cremated, and I'd been told it was, after the closed casket service, I'd assumed without questioning there was no physical remains to exhume. My daughter-in-law had been listed as primary beneficiary on Caleb's life insurance policy, $1.2 million. She had filed and received that claim 11 months ago. "Did you know about the policy?" Ray asked. I didn't know the amount. I knew there was a policy because Caleb had mentioned it years ago. Responsible father stuff, making sure the kids were covered. I didn't know about the amount, and I didn't know she'd already collected. "Has she made any inquiries about the ranch?" Tom asked. And there it was. 3 months after the funeral, my daughter-in-law had sent a letter through a Portland attorney asking me to consider transferring the ranch deed to a family trust she was establishing for Emma and Tyler's future. "For the children's security," she'd said. I'd told her I would think about it. I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't done anything about it. Something had made me set that letter aside and never respond. Some instinct I couldn't name. And now sitting at Ray's table, I understood that instinct had probably saved everything. "She hasn't pushed it?" Tom asked. "Not directly. But she'd started limiting my access to the grandchildren more aggressively about 4 months after I'd left that letter unanswered. I thought I was being paranoid about the connection. I wasn't. Ray drove me home that evening and said 3 words before he left. "Don't call her." What followed were 12 days that I will spend the rest of my life processing. Ray had contacts, people from his law enforcement years who still owed him professional favors. He reached out carefully, quietly, asking about traffic fatalities on Highway 30 inches March of the previous year. There had been an accident, a real one, a jackknifed semi, 2 injuries, but the vehicle descriptions didn't match Caleb's car. The driver fatally injured in the incident was a man 9 years older than my son, with no connection to our family. The death certificate Tom obtained through official channels listed the cause as blunt force trauma consistent with vehicular impact. The attending physician's license number on the document traced to a doctor, Martin Cole in Portland. Tom called the Oregon Medical Board. Dr. Cole's license had been suspended 14 months earlier for insurance fraud. My daughter-in-law had filed my son's death using a fraudulent certificate signed by a corrupt doctor. Caleb wasn't dead. He was somewhere. And someone had kept him there for 2 years, while his wife collected his life insurance and moved on as though he had never existed. The hardest day of those 12 days was a Sunday, when Emma and Tyler came to the ranch for what my daughter-in-law had started calling supervised visits, her word, as though I were a risk factor rather than their grandfather. I watched Tyler chase the barn cat across the yard and Emma sit on the fence rail with her sketchbook the way she always did, drawing the mountains. She'd started drawing mountains obsessively after her father's funeral. Carol's apple tree replaced by peaks she'd never told me the names of. "Grandpa," Emma said without looking up from her page, "do you think Dad can see us? Like from heaven?" The wooden rail under my hands was rough and real. I thought about the postcard in the lockbox. I thought about what a 9-year-old girl deserves to know about her father and when she deserves to know it. "I think your dad loves you more than anything in the world," I said. "I think that never stops, no matter what." She looked at me then, a long, evaluating look she'd inherited straight from Caleb. You said loves, she said, not loved. I held her gaze and said nothing. She turned back to her sketchbook, but she was smiling, just slightly, like someone who had just received confirmation of something she had been keeping to herself for a very long time. After they left, Ray called. He'd found something. A cabin property, registered to a holding company incorporated in Nevada. But the managing member on the original filing was a name Ray recognized, a man named Dale Pruitt who had done 2 years in federal prison for wire fraud, and whose last known associates included a Portland attorney who, it turned out, shared office space with my daughter-in-law's family law team. The property was in Lincoln County, near the Idaho border. Remote, accessible by a logging road that wasn't on any public map. Ray didn't go alone. He brought 2 former deputies he trusted absolutely. They drove up on a Thursday, told anyone who asked they were doing a welfare check on a property with an outstanding tax dispute, and they found my son. Ray called me from the road on the drive back. His voice was steady the way it gets when he's working very hard to stay professional. He's alive, Walter. He's okay. He's with me. I have tried several times to describe what happened inside my chest when Ray said those words. I have not found the language. I don't think the language exists. Caleb was thin, pale in the way of someone who had been indoors for a long time without adequate sunlight. He had a beard he'd never worn before, and his eyes had a wariness in them I hadn't seen since he was a teenager going through a difficult year. But it was my son. When he walked through my front door 4 hours later, and I put my arms around him, he gripped me back the way he had when he was Tyler's age, and woke up scared in the night, with everything he had. We sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. He talked and I listened. They had argued about money, Caleb and his wife, serious arguments that had been building for a year. She had wanted him to access his trust fund early, the account his grandmother had established for him, the one with specific restrictions preventing early withdrawal without board approval. He had refused. She had become someone he didn't recognize, cold and tactical in a way that frightened him. She had begun moving money out of their joint accounts in small increments. He had hired an attorney quietly and started keeping records. 2 days before the accident, she had told him she wanted a divorce. He had agreed. He had been, he said, relieved. The night before he was supposed to meet his own attorney to start the process, he had gone for a run along the river trail near their house. He didn't remember much after the first mile. He woke up in Lincoln County. His phone was gone. His wallet was gone. He was told that there had been an accident, that he had sustained a serious head injury, that he was under private medical care arranged by his wife as his emergency contact. A man he'd never seen before, claiming to be a nurse, monitored him. A woman who checked in twice a week was introduced only as a case manager. He had no way to communicate. Every attempt he made to reach outside was monitored or intercepted. He was not physically restrained, but the cabin was miles from any public road, and he had been told, repeatedly, that his wife had legal power of attorney over his medical decisions and that any attempt to leave would result in his being committed to an inpatient psychiatric facility for his own protection. He had believed her capable of it. That was the thing that hurt most to hear, that his own wife had built such a thorough architecture of fear around him that he had doubted his own ability to survive fighting back, until he found a way. Dale Pruitt, the man who owned the property, had a younger brother who did occasional maintenance work on the cabin. His name was Gary. He was not, Caleb said, a bad man. He was someone who'd gotten pulled into something for money and had spent 2 years trying not to look directly at what he was doing. Caleb had worked on Gary slowly, methodically, over 4 months, the way you work on a stubborn fence post, finding the angle, applying steady pressure. He had written the postcard. He had convinced Gary to deliver it. Gary had never been told the full scope of what my daughter-in-law had done. He had believed the cover story, a man in mental health crisis, a wife trying to protect the family. When Caleb laid out the reality, the falsified death certificate, the insurance fraud, the grandchildren being raised to think their father was buried in the ground, Gary had gone quiet for a very long time. Then he had put the postcard in his shirt pocket and driven to Billings. Tom filed the emergency motions the following Monday. The documentation was extensive and overwhelming. The falsified death certificate, the suspended doctor's license, the insurance fraud, the financial records Caleb had been quietly compiling before his disappearance. The records Ray's contacts had pulled on Dale Pruitt and the holding company, and a sworn statement from Gary Pruitt, who had retained his own attorney and was cooperating fully in exchange for consideration. My daughter-in-law's attorney tried to argue mental instability on my son's part. The court-appointed psychiatrist who evaluated Caleb spent 2.5 hours with him and submitted a report that was unambiguous. Caleb Hayes was of sound mind, clear recollection, and had been the victim of unlawful false imprisonment. She was arrested on a Wednesday afternoon. I know this because Emma called me from a neighbor's house, her voice remarkably composed for a 9-year-old, and said that police had come to the house and taken her mother away, and could she and Tyler please come to the ranch. I was in the truck before she finished the sentence. The drive to Portland takes 9 hours from Billings. I have made it in 8.25. I will not tell you what speed I drove, but I will tell you that when I pulled up to the neighbor's house, and Tyler came running down the driveway, still in his pajamas, and launched himself at me, I held that boy for a long time in the cold October air and did not care about anything else in the world. Emma came out more slowly, her sketchbook under one arm, studying my face the way she always does. Then she looked past me, at the truck, and her breath caught. Caleb was in the passenger seat. She stood completely still for 3 seconds. Then she walked to the truck and opened the door and climbed in, and my son put his arms around his daughter, and I watched through the windshield, and I let myself cry for the first time since that March morning 2 years ago when I had sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs stopped working. Tyler, still in my arms, tugged my jacket. "Is that really my dad?" "Yes," I said. "That's really your dad." He thought about this for a moment with the serious thoroughness of a 6-year-old processing something important. Then he wriggled down and sprinted to the truck. What came after the arrest moved faster than I expected, which Tom told me was a sign of how much evidence there was. My daughter-in-law was charged on multiple counts: insurance fraud, falsification of a death certificate, conspiracy, and unlawful imprisonment. Dale Pruitt was charged alongside her. Dr. Martin Cole, whose license was already suspended, faced federal fraud charges. 2 other individuals connected to the scheme were identified in the course of the investigation. She pleaded not guilty at the arraignment. Her attorneys were expensive and confident. That confidence lasted until the evidentiary hearing, when Tom presented 22 months of financial records showing a systematic transfer of funds from Caleb's accounts to a series of LLCs my daughter-in-law had created. A total of $847,000 moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic flags. Combined with the $1.2 million insurance payout, she had believed she was building something permanent. She had not counted on Gary Pruitt's conscience. She had not counted on a postcard with no stamp delivered to a rural mailbox by a man who drove 4 hours because he could no longer look at himself in the mirror. She had not counted on the fact that my son, alone in a cabin for 2 years with nothing but time, had kept a journal. Every interaction, every name, every date, every inconsistency in what he'd been told, written in the margins of paperback novels from a box in the cabin's storage closet. 47 pages of documentation in handwriting so small you needed good light to read it. Tom submitted it as Exhibit F. She was convicted on all counts. The sentencing judge noted that the deliberate cruelty of staging a man's death for his children, allowing 2 small children to grieve a living parent, warranted the maximum under the applicable statutes. 18 years, no early consideration. Gary Pruitt served 14 months and was released. Before he went in, I drove to meet him at the county jail during visiting hours. He was a quiet man, medium height, with the look of someone who had spent a long time carrying something heavy. We sat across from each other at a metal table, and he said he was sorry in a way that told me he had said it to himself many more times than he would ever say it out loud. I told him that without him, my son would still be in that cabin. I told him that whatever came next for him, he had done the right thing when it mattered, and that counted for something real. He nodded slowly and looked at his hands. "How are the kids?" he asked. I told him they were doing well. I told him Tyler had learned to ride the old quarter horse that spring. I told him Emma had started drawing people again, not just mountains. He nodded again. Something in his face eased slightly. Caleb moved back to the ranch in January, 6 weeks after the sentencing. He came with 2 duffel bags and his children, and a quietness that was different from the Caleb I'd raised, but not lesser. Harder and more deliberate, the way metal is after it's been through heat. The first morning, he was up before sunrise. I found him in the barn doing the exact same feeding routine he'd learned at 14, as though his hands had been waiting 2 years to remember what they were for. Emma enrolled in the school in Billings. She made a friend within the first week, a girl who also kept a sketchbook, and the two of them spent that first winter filling pages with horses and mountains and the specific light that comes off the snow in January when the sky is clear. Tyler discovered that the barn cat had kittens and appointed himself their official guardian with a seriousness that reminded me of Caleb at that age, completely committed to whatever responsibility was in front of him. There were hard days. I will not pretend otherwise. The nights were difficult for a while, for all of us in different ways. Caleb had sessions twice a week over video call with a therapist in Billings who specialized in trauma. Emma saw a counselor through her school, a kind woman who sent me a note after the second month saying Emma was one of the most resilient children she had worked with, a sentence I read twice and then taped to the inside of my kitchen cabinet door where I see it every morning. Tyler had questions, the direct, unfiltered questions of a 6-year-old, and Caleb answered them as honestly as he could in terms Tyler could hold. Where was Daddy? He was somewhere far away, and he couldn't get back right away. Why not? Because some people were keeping him from coming back. Did they hurt him? No. Is he okay now? Yes. Is he going to go away again? No. He is not going to go away again. Tyler thought about this. Then he went back to the kittens. There is an evening that stays with me. Late April, the days just starting to stretch. That particular Montana dusk where the sky goes 4 colors at once and the air smells like cold earth warming up. Caleb and I were on the porch after dinner, Emma and Tyler inside doing homework, the sound of them arguing cheerfully about something coming through the screen door. Caleb had his coffee and I had mine, and neither of us said anything for a while because neither of us needed to. Finally, he said, "Mom knew." I looked at him. "She never said anything specific," he said, "but the way she looked at her, at the end, Mom never trusted her. She just kept it to herself because she didn't want to cause trouble." I thought about Carol, about the things she noticed that she filed away quietly and never weaponized, the way she'd loved without requiring everyone else to love the same people in the same way. The grace of that. She would have fought like hell if she'd been here, I said. Caleb smiled at the horizon. I know. That's where I learned it. The stars came out one by one over the ridge. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and knocked against its stall. The kittens were inside now. Tyler had smuggled them in 3 weeks ago, and I was pretending not to. Emma's voice rose briefly over Tyler's, and then they both laughed about something and went quiet. I had come very close to losing all of this. I had spent 2 years burying my son in a grief that turned out to be a lie, walking the fence lines he should have walked with me, watching the seasons turn over land that was supposed to pass to him, telling myself that loss was something you learned to carry rather than something you could ever set down. The postcard was still in the lockbox. I hadn't thrown it away. I didn't think I ever would. 3 lines in handwriting I had known since my son was 7 years old, forming 3 sentences that had cost a man 14 months of his life to deliver. If you are a parent watching this, I want to say something to you directly. There are warning signs we dismiss because dismissing them is easier than facing them. The smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the explanation that is slightly too smooth, the instinct that something is wrong that we override because we don't want to be the person who causes problems. I overrode those instincts for 11 years. I called my concerns uncharitable. I told myself I was being protective of my son in ways that weren't my business. What I know now is this. Your instincts are not cruelty. Your unease is not paranoia. When something is wrong, some part of you already knows it, and that part deserves to be heard. Don't wait for a postcard. Don't wait until the wrong person has 2 years of your son's life, and a fraudulent death certificate and a life insurance check already deposited. Ask the hard questions early. Trust the people who have always told you the truth. And when someone hands you information you cannot explain through comfortable logic, do not drive home and convince yourself it means nothing. I almost did that in a hardware store parking lot in October. I almost set a postcard aside and went back to grieving a man who was alive and waiting. I don't know what would have happened if I had. I don't let myself think about it for very long. What I know is what I have. A son who comes in from the barn at sunrise smelling like hay and cold air. A granddaughter who draws people again. A grandson who has named all 4 kittens after Montana rivers. A lockbox in the bedroom that holds Carol's jewelry. and a postcard I will keep until the day I am buried in the same cemetery where my son's empty headstone still stands, waiting to be corrected. We are going to have that headstone removed in the spring. Caleb asked if he could be there when they take it out. I told him we all would be, the four of us, together. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Subscribe to vt-sweetrevenge and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere right now, someone is holding information they don't know what to do with, and they need to know that the truth, no matter how long it takes, is always worth fighting for.